When generals sacrificed an army, war is often remembered through dates, maps, and the names of commanders. Yet behind every line on a battlefield map are human lives, shaped by decisions made far from the sound of gunfire. In every major conflict, there comes a moment when strategy begins to outweigh humanity. Throughout modern history, armies have been ordered to advance when retreat was the only logical choice. They were told to hold positions that could not be held and to attack defenses that no courage could overcome. These decisions were rarely made out of cruelty, but from belief in doctrine, political pressure, and the idea that sacrifice itself could bring victory. By the early 20th century, warfare had changed completely. Machine guns, artillery, and industrial-scale destruction turned battlefields into killing grounds. Yet many commanders continued to fight with ideas shaped by the past. Entire units were sent forward knowing the cost, and when they failed, others were sent to replace them. This documentary explores why generals chose sacrifice over adaptation, how armies became expendable tools of strategy, and what happens when human lives are treated as acceptable losses. This is the story of when generals sacrificed an army. When doctrine became deadly. To understand how generals could sacrifice an entire army, we must first understand the world they came from. Most senior commanders of the early 20th century were trained in a very different kind of war. Their education was shaped by 19th century conflicts, where decisive battles were won through maneuver, morale, and aggressive offense. In those wars, bold advances were rewarded, hesitation was punished, and casualties, tog tragic, were considered an unavoidable part of victory. This way of thinking became doctrine. It was written into manuals, taught in academies, and passed from one generation of officers to the next. According to this belief, an army that stopped attacking would lose initiative, morale, and eventually the war itself. Defense was considered temporary. Retreat was seen not as strategy, but as failure. When industrial warfare arrived, this doctrine did not disappear. It simply collided with a new reality. By the time the First World War began, technology had transformed the battlefield. Firepower had increased far beyond what any previous generation had experienced. A single machine gun could replace dozens of riflemen. Artillery could bombard targets kilometers away with devastating accuracy. Railways allowed entire armies to be supplied continuously, meaning defenders could reinforce positions faster than attackers could break them. Yet many generals refused to fully accept what this meant. They acknowledged that casualties would be high, but believed that determination and persistence would eventually overwhelm any defense. If one attack failed, the solution was not to stop, but to attack again, and then again, with more men. In their minds, sacrifice was not pointless. It was proof of commitment. This belief was reinforced by political pressure. Governments expected results. Civilian leaders demanded progress that could be shown on maps and reported to the public. A general who ordered a retreat risked being accused of weakness or incompetence. Holding ground and launching offensives, no matter the cost, appeared decisive and strong. As a result, commanders often found themselves trapped. Admitting that an offensive had failed meant admitting that tens of thousands had died for nothing. Continuing the attack, however costly, allowed them to argue that victory was still possible. Just one more push away. For soldiers on the front lines, this logic felt very different. Infantrymen quickly learned the patterns of industrial war. They knew which valleys were covered by machine gun fire. They recognized artillery ranges and killing zones. They saw what happened to the units sent forward before them. Survivors returned wounded, traumatized, or silent. Often, they did not return at all. Despite this knowledge, orders remained the same. Advance at dawn. Cross open ground. Capture the objective. Hold it at all costs. The phrase "at all costs" became one of the most dangerous orders in modern warfare. It removed flexibility. It removed judgment. And most importantly, it removed the value of human life from the equation. Once a position was declared vital, any loss could be justified. Casualty reports were filed, numbers were recorded, and replacements were sent forward. The objective remained unchanged, even as the bodies piled up. Imanicas's generals did not fully grasp the scale of destruction their orders caused. Communication from the front was slow, incomplete, or filtered through layers of command. Maps showed arrows and lines, not shattered units and broken men. Reports spoke of progress measured in meters, not lives. But ignorance was not the only factor. Some commanders did understand exactly what was happening, and still chose to continue. They believed that stopping would be worse than losing more men. They feared that hesitation would invite enemy counterattacks or political consequences. They convinced themselves that sacrifice today would prevent even greater sacrifice tomorrow. This mindset turned armies into instruments of attrition. Victory was no longer about maneuver or surprise, but about endurance. The side that could lose more men and continue fighting was expected to win. For nations with large populations, this logic seemed acceptable. Soldiers became numbers to be managed rather than individuals to be preserved. Entire units could be destroyed and replaced, sometimes several times over, without changing the overall strategy. Yet this approach ignored a critical reality. Armies are not endless. Training takes time. Morale cannot be replaced as easily as manpower, and each loss weakened not only the fighting force, but the society that supported it. As months turned into years, the gap between command and reality widened. Generals spoke of honor, duty, and perseverance. Soldiers spoke of exhaustion, fear, and futility. Both believed they were serving their country, but they were living in entirely different worlds. The result was a tragic imbalance of power. Those who made decisions rarely faced the consequences directly. Those who faced the consequences had no power to change the decisions. This was the environment in which entire armies could be sacrificed without a single decisive victory to justify the cost. Doctrine demanded offense. Politics demanded action. Pride resisted adaptation. And human lives became the currency used to sustain a failing strategy. In the next part, we will look more closely at how this thinking played out on the battlefield itself, where repeated offensives turned limited objectives into symbols of obsession, and where holding ground became more important than saving an army that was slowly being destroyed. The cost of holding the line. Once an offensive began, stopping it became extraordinarily difficult. Planes were drawn weeks in advance, artillery schedules carefully calculated, and political expectations already set. To halt an attack meant more than changing tactics. It meant admitting failure. For many commanders, that admission was more dangerous than the losses themselves. As a result, battles that were meant to last days stretched into weeks, and those meant to last weeks dragged on for months. Objectives that were originally described as limited and achievable slowly transformed into symbols of determination. A village, a ridge, or a stretch of ruined ground took on meaning far beyond its strategic value. To abandon it was seen as weakness. To continue fighting for it, no matter the cost, was framed as resolve. This mindset turned the battlefield into a grinder. Infantry assaults followed a grim rhythm. Artillery would bombard enemy positions for hours or even days, tearing up the landscape but rarely destroying well-protected defenses. When the guns fell silent, soldiers were ordered forward, crossing open ground scarred by craters and mud. Defenders emerged from dugouts. Machine guns were brought back into position, and the advance collapsed under concentrated fire. Survivors reached the objective only to discover that it offered little protection and no clear advantage. Holding it required constant reinforcement. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies struggled to reach the front. Casualties mounted not only from enemy fire, but from exhaustion, exposure, and disease. Despite these realities, orders rarely changed. If the first assault failed, a second was planned. If the second failed, a third followed. Each new attack was justified by the losses already suffered. To stop now, commanders argued, would mean those men had died for nothing. This logic created a cycle that was almost impossible to escape. For soldiers in the trenches, the meaning of sacrifice became painfully clear. They watched units arrive full of strength and confidence, only to be reduced to fragments within days. New replacements were often young, poorly prepared, and unfamiliar with the terrain. Veterans tried to teach them what to expect, but there was little time and less hope. The psychological toll was immense. Fear was constant. Sleep was rare. The sound of artillery never truly faded, even during moments of relative calm. Many soldiers came to believe that survival was a matter of luck rather than skill or courage. The idea of victory felt distant and abstract, while the reality of death was immediate and personal. Commanders, meanwhile, struggled to maintain the illusion of control. Reports were written to emphasize gains and minimize losses. A few hundred meters advanced became a success. A ridge, partially secured, was presented as progress. These reports moved up the chain of command, reinforcing the belief that persistence would eventually bring breakthrough. In some cases, breakthroughs did occur. Lines were pierced. Enemy positions were overrun, but even success came at an enormous cost. The attacking force was often so weakened that it could not exploit its gains. Fresh enemy reserves counterattacked, and the ground changed hands once more. The result was a war of attrition, where territory mattered less than endurance. Victory was no longer about decisive maneuver, but about who could absorb greater losses over time. This approach placed immense strain on nations as a whole. Factories worked continuously to replace weapons and equipment. Training camps rushed new soldiers to the front. Families at home received telegrams announcing death or injury, often with little explanation beyond a vague reference to duty and honor. Public support was maintained through careful messaging. Sacrifice was framed as necessary and noble. Doubt was discouraged. Criticism of military leadership was often portrayed as disloyal or dangerous. In this environment, questioning the value of an offensive could be seen as undermining the war effort itself. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Soldiers wrote letters, expressing frustration and despair. Some units showed signs of collapse, refusing orders or breaking under pressure. Morale declined as it became clear that sacrifices were not bringing decisive results. Commanders responded with discipline, believing that firmness was the only way to maintain order. In extreme cases, punishment was used to enforce obedience. The threat of court-martial or execution served as a grim reminder that disobedience could be fatal, even away from the enemy. For many soldiers, this reinforced the feeling that they were trapped between two forces, the enemy in front and authority behind. Despite everything, the cycle continued. Each new offensive promised to be different. Better planning, heavier artillery, more troops. Each time, the same fundamental problem remained. The battlefield favored defense, and human endurance had limits. By the latest stages of the war, some commanders began to recognize this reality. New tactics emerged. Combined arms, improved coordination, and more flexible planning showed that adaptation was possible. But these lessons came slowly, and often too late for the armies already sacrificed in earlier campaigns. The cost of holding the line was not only measured in lives lost, it was measured in a generation scarred by trauma, in societies exhausted by grief, and in trust eroded between those who commanded and those who obeyed. As the war dragged on, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. No amount of sacrifice could compensate for flawed assumptions. No volume of bloodshed could force victory from a strategy that no longer matched the nature of war. In the final part, we will examine how the consequences of these decisions became impossible to deny, and how the sacrifice of entire armies reshaped military thinking, political leadership, and the memory of war itself. Lessons written in blood. As the war continued, the consequences of sacrificing entire armies became impossible to ignore. Casualty lists grew so long that they blurred into abstraction. Yet behind every name was a family, a community, and a future that would never be lived. Nations began to realize that even the largest armies were not limitless, and that endurance alone could not replace sound strategy. On the battlefield, exhaustion became as dangerous as the enemy. Units that had fought for months without rest lost cohesion and effectiveness. Experienced soldiers were killed or wounded faster than they could be replaced. New recruits arrived with minimal training, often thrust into combat before they fully understood what was expected of them. The army continued to exist on paper, but its true strength steadily declined. Commanders who had once believed in relentless offense were forced to confront reality. Some adapted, introducing new tactics that emphasized coordination, timing, and flexibility. Infantry, artillery, armor, and air support began to work together more closely. Attacks became more limited in scope, designed to achieve realistic objectives rather than symbolic victories. However, adaptation was uneven. While some leaders learned from failure, others remained committed to earlier beliefs. For them, changing course felt like admitting responsibility for the lives already lost. It was easier to argue that success was just one final effort away than to accept that the strategy itself had been flawed from the beginning. This resistance to change had lasting consequences. In several campaigns, armies were effectively destroyed not by a single catastrophic defeat, but by a series of decisions that slowly drained their strength. Battalions were reduced to companies, companies to platoons. Entire formations remained in name only, their combat powers shattered beyond recovery. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Many soldiers carried the weight of having witnessed repeated waves of comrades sent into hopeless situations. Trust in leadership eroded. The belief that obedience would lead to victory was replaced by a grim focus on personal survival. Even when the war ended, these experiences followed veterans home, shaping their lives in ways that were often invisible but deeply enduring. At the national level, the cost of sacrifice reshaped politics and society. Governments faced growing pressure to explain the losses and justify the decisions that had led to them. Public confidence in military leadership declined, and the image of the infallible general began to fade. In its place emerged a more critical understanding of command responsibility and accountability. Military institutions, too, were forced to reflect. After the war, doctrines were training emphasized adaptability, communication, and the preservation of fighting strength. The idea that an army could simply be spent for gain was increasingly challenged. Sacrifice was no longer viewed as proof of commitment, but as a failure to find a better solution. Yet the lessons were not always fully learned. In later conflicts, echoes of the same thinking reappeared. Pressure for quick results, fear of retreat, and the desire to demonstrate resolve continued to influence decision-making. The temptation to trade lives for time or territory did not disappear. It merely took new forms, shaped by new technologies and political realities. What changed most significantly was awareness. The memory of earlier sacrifices made it harder to ignore the human cost of command decisions. Soldiers, journalists, and civilians alike began to question strategies that relied on overwhelming loss. The distance between the battlefield and the public narrowed, and with it came greater scrutiny. Looking back, it is clear that generals who sacrificed entire armies were not acting in isolation. They were products of their training, their culture, and the immense pressures of total war. Understanding this does not excuse the outcomes, but it helps explain how such decisions became possible and why they were repeated. The tragedy lies not only in the lives lost, but in the delay in recognizing change. Industrial warfare demanded new ways of thinking, yet adaptation came only after unimaginable cost. The price of clinging to outdated ideas was paid by those who had the least power to influence them. In the end, a story of sacrificed armies is a reminder of the responsibility carried by those in command. Every order has consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Every decision to attack, to hold, or to continue a failing strategy shapes the fate of thousands. War will always involve risk and loss. But when loss becomes routine and sacrifice becomes strategy, the purpose of war itself is called into question. History does not judge leaders solely by the ground they gained or the battles they won, but by the lives they chose to spend along the way. This is why the story of when generals sacrificed an army still matters today. It is not only a lesson about the past, but a warning for the future. Because the true measure of leadership in war is not how much it is willing to sacrifice, but how wisely it chooses when sacrifice is truly necessary.